Chosen ones. There are pages in this world that were never meant to be turned, and yet here you stand, at the edge of the final one. The Kybalion, a book whispered about in esoteric halls, dismissed by the public as mere philosophy, has a last page that most will never see, not because it's missing, but because it reveals itself only when the right eyes fall upon it. The president had been briefed. The room was secured. Military aides lined the walls, their hands twitching near holsters not from threat, but from the heaviness in the air. The briefcase was placed on the desk. Its brass clasps clicked open like the ticking of a clock approaching its final second. Inside, under a black velvet shroud, lay the original manuscript, its edges browned with age, yet strangely warm to the touch. No one dared move until he did. The president flipped through the pages, his breath steady at first, then shallow. The ancient ink bled symbols and diagrams, shifting subtly as if alive, and then the final page. It wasn't text alone. It was a mark, an emblem that seemed to breathe in the lamplight. The lines curved and interlocked like rivers meeting at a predestined delta, and at its center, your symbol, the one you've carried unknowingly in dreams, the one hidden in childhood sketches you never showed anyone. The color drained from his face. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. One of the aides whispered a question, but he waved them off, his eyes locked to the page. He knew what this meant, not politically, not historically, but cosmically. This wasn't about national security. It wasn't even about him. The Kybalion's final truth had found its living subject. Somewhere deep in the pages, beneath the principles of Hermetic law, there was a phrase written in a language older than Egypt's sands. It pulsed faintly, like embers waiting for breath. He traced the letters, and in that instant, something unseen shifted in the air around you, because the page was never just ink and paper. It was a mirror, and it had finally recognized its reflection. The corridor to the private study was narrow, lined with portraits of past leaders whose eyes seemed to follow every step. The carpet muffled the sound of polished shoes, but not the tension in the air. 2 guards remained stationed outside, each knowing they would never be allowed inside once the door closed. The briefcase sat on the table as if it had been waiting for decades. Its leather was cracked, yet it carried a strange sheen, like the surface of a river at midnight. The brass clasps were marked with an unfamiliar sigil, neither military nor governmental. And each time the lamplight hit them, the shape seemed to alter ever so slightly. No one could quite recall who had delivered it, only that it had arrived without warning, accompanied by a chain of authorizations that bypassed every known protocol. The president approached slowly, his fingertips hovering above the leather before making contact. A faint warmth radiated from it, unnatural for an object that had been sitting untouched in a cool room. He sat, placed both hands on the case, and for a moment simply breathed. He unlocked the first clasp, and the sound was sharper than expected, echoing faintly against the wooden walls. The second clasp followed, and the air in the room seemed to thicken, carrying a subtle, almost metallic scent. He opened the lid halfway, as though uncertain whether to proceed, then fully, revealing a stack of documents beneath a folded piece of silk so black it seemed to drink in the light. Removing the silk exposed the manuscript, its paper trembling as if reacting to the shift in air. The ink was neither faded nor fresh. It seemed timeless, immune to decay. Margins were filled with handwritten notes in a script no one present could read, yet everyone felt they somehow understood. As the president's eyes scanned the first few pages, something passed through him. A flicker of recognition so deep it unsettled him. His aides exchanged glances, sensing a change in his demeanor. He continued to turn the pages, each movement slower than the last, until he reached a point where his hand simply stopped, mid-turn. Outside the room, a clock ticked once, then twice, before the sound vanished completely. It was here, in this silence, that the manuscript began to speak without words. The next page, he knew, would change everything. The president's fingers lingered on the edge of the page, as if touching it might set something irreversible in motion. The aides stood frozen, watching for any sign that he might give the order to close the briefcase. But he didn't. Slowly, he turned it, and the next page emerged, carrying not diagrams or principles, but a single block of text written in an ancient tongue. A translator had been brought in earlier, told only that the work was philosophical. He now stepped forward, adjusting his glasses, the weight of the room pressing down on him. His eyes scanned the symbols, and his breathing changed. He didn't need long. It was not just philosophy. It was a parable, and not just any parable. The words described a man walking along a narrow road, speaking to those who had fallen behind. He told them of a kingdom not bound by earth, where the first would be last, and the last would be first. The imagery was vivid: fields of light, gates of living stone, and a voice calling each traveler by a name only they would know. The translator's voice wavered as he read aloud, his tone shifting from professional detachment to something more personal. He recognized the structure, the rhythm. It was nearly identical to the words recorded in an ancient gospel, the Nazarene's own teaching about the path and the door. Even the phrasing, though written in a language predating the New Testament, mirrored the essence of that message. The president's gaze locked onto the manuscript, his knuckles white against the table. He had been raised to think of Scripture as a separate realm from state matters, yet here it was, intersecting without his permission. The Kybalion's hidden page was not simply borrowing imagery. It was amplifying it, as if the original parable had been a fragment of a far older truth. The aides shifted uncomfortably. One of them mouthed the final line the translator spoke. "He who knows the law, written before the stars, shall see the law fulfilled within himself." It hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. A faint vibration passed through the table, rattling a pen against the wood. No one had moved. The translator stepped back, his face pale, eyes avoiding the president's. The next line in the manuscript was written in red, a color too vivid for its age. The president leaned forward, knowing he was about to see something no law or creed had prepared him for. The manuscript was closed again, not from dismissal, but to slow the weight of what it had revealed. The president called for a name, one not on the official list of advisors. Within minutes, a woman entered, her hair streaked with silver, her posture impeccable, despite the long walk from the National Library's secure wing. She had been the keeper of restricted archives for 3 decades, known for her ability to decode texts without ever making a visible note. She approached the table and slipped off one glove, revealing fingers dusted faintly with chalk residue from old folios. The other glove, however, she did not remove. She rested her gloved hand on the manuscript's edge, and the fabric darkened, as though ink from the page had seeped upward to greet it. Her eyes narrowed. She spoke quietly, telling the president that this was no ordinary script. The visible words were a veil, concealing a cipher only accessible through contact, not with skin, but with material treated in a specific compound. That compound, she hinted, was embedded in the threads of her glove, a method passed down through her predecessors without explanation. She pressed the gloved palm flat against the page, and slowly, ghostly shapes began to form between the lines of the visible text. Numbers, curves, and intersecting lines emerged like frost on glass. The aides stepped closer, their skepticism fading as the symbols arranged themselves into patterns too deliberate to be random. She explained that the cipher was not meant to be read in sequence, but to be seen all at once, a single burst of understanding. The moment the president's eyes caught the full design, something shifted in his breathing. It was a map, not of land, but of thought. A pathway structured like a labyrinth where every turn mirrored a principle of the Kybalion. But there was more. At the center of the cipher, unmistakable even to the untrained, was the same symbol that had shaken him before. Only now it was connected by faint lines to 8 other symbols, each radiating outward like points on a star. The librarian withdrew her hand, and the symbols faded as if they had never been there. She did not look satisfied. Instead, she leaned closer to the president and whispered that one of those outer points had been missing from the archives her entire career, until now. The librarian's words hung in the air, heavier than any official report. The president ordered the room cleared, save for her, 2 aides, and a single recorder whose role was not to transcribe, but to witness. The manuscript was placed back onto the table, the air around it carrying a stillness that felt almost sacred. The librarian explained that one of the outer points in the cipher aligned with a seal she had seen only once before, in a forbidden wing beneath the library. It was carved into a stone tablet, encased in glass, marked as unopenable under any circumstances. She warned that its presence in the cipher meant the seal was connected not just to the manuscript, but to the figure whose teachings were scattered through time like seeds, the Nazarene. The president said nothing, only gestured for her to continue. She described the seal: 2 concentric circles, crossed by a single vertical line. At its heart was a shape that could be a tear or a flame, and beneath it, words etched in a tongue so old it predated even the Kybalion's supposed origins. The first time she saw it, she had been unable to move for minutes, caught by the sensation that the carving was watching her. She confessed that years ago, in a moment of reckless curiosity, she had whispered a name while standing before the seal. Not the name she had been told in her faith, but the name she had once found in a hidden commentary, a variation of Yeshua spoken in a dialect lost to history. The instant the word left her lips, a hairline crack appeared in the seal's outer ring. It was faint, yet impossible to ignore. Now, seeing it again in the cipher structure, she knew the crack had not been accidental. The manuscript was more than text. It was a key, and the seal was one of its locks. The president finally spoke, his voice low, asking what would happen if the seal were fully broken. She didn't answer at first. Her gaze drifted toward the heavy curtains drawn over the room's only window, as if something might be waiting on the other side. When she finally met his eyes, her answer was a whisper. She said the seal wasn't meant to keep something in. It was meant to keep something out. The decision to visit the sealed chamber was made without a formal order. There was no public record, no schedule entry, only a discreet movement through corridors rarely walked. The librarian led, her steps unhurried yet deliberate, the echo of each footfall swallowed by stone. The aides followed, carrying no weapons, not because they weren't allowed, but because the place they were heading rendered them meaningless. They descended a spiral staircase lit by narrow shafts of amber light filtering through vents above. The air grew cooler with every step, scented faintly with dust and something older, something metallic. At the bottom, a door of reinforced iron stood embedded in the rock. It bore no handle, only a circular depression at chest height, smooth from centuries of human touch. The librarian pressed her gloved palm against it. There was a pause, then a muted click, followed by a slow grinding as the door shifted open. The chamber beyond was dim, lit only by oil lamps mounted in niches along the wall. Their flames burned low, as though conserving themselves for watchers who might never come. The walls were covered with murals, not painted, but carved. They depicted figures in robes, some holding scrolls, others lifting their faces toward a sky carved with symbols instead of stars. None of the faces looked directly outward. Every gaze was angled away, as if to avoid what lay in the center of the room, and in that center stood the seal. It was larger than the librarian's description had suggested, nearly the height of a man. The circles gleamed faintly, not with polish, but as if the stone itself resisted aging. The vertical line bisected it cleanly, and at the center, the flame-shaped mark pulsed faintly, almost imperceptible, unless one stared too long. The aides tried to look, but within seconds their eyes darted away. One muttered under his breath, claiming he saw movement in the stone, as though the flame had shifted. Another turned entirely, facing the wall, his shoulders tense. The president stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the seal, unblinking. The air thickened, and the low flames along the walls leaned inward as if drawn toward the center. The president's gaze lingered on the seal until the librarian motioned toward a narrow desk set against the far wall. Upon it rested a single leather-bound ledger, its edges frayed but intact. She explained that this ledger had been here longer than the chamber's recorded history, and that no archivist had been able to carry it beyond the threshold without the ink vanishing from its pages. He opened it slowly, and the scent of aged paper rose like a faint ghost. Most of the entries were written in meticulous script, cataloging objects, dates, and cryptic references to events both historical and unrecorded. The writing itself seemed to shift subtly under the lamplight, as though each glance revealed a slightly altered shape to the letters. It was on the third page that his eyes stopped. In the left margin, faint but unmistakable, was the shape of a cross. It was not drawn deliberately. Rather, it seemed to have formed where the ink had bled and curved over time. The librarian leaned in, her brow furrowing. She whispered that she had never seen this before, though she had handled the ledger dozens of times. The cross was peculiar. Its proportions matched no common design, yet its form evoked a striking familiarity. The vertical beam extended just slightly below the base, and the horizontal bar was higher than the center, a style seen only in ancient depictions of the Nazarene's crucifixion, predating the iconography found in later cathedrals. As the president traced it lightly with his fingertip, The surrounding ink darkened, revealing words faintly embedded in the margin itself. They were not in the main text, but hidden in the very fibers of the page. He could not read them, but the librarian began to translate in a hushed tone. The words spoke of a figure who would stand where law and light converged, whose mark would awaken seals long closed. One aide shifted uneasily, recognizing fragments that mirrored a gospel verse. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. It was a line attributed to Yeshua, yet here it was, woven into the ledger of a sealed chamber, in a place untouched by public scripture. The president closed the ledger, but the cross remained imprinted in his mind. As he glanced back toward the seal in the center of the chamber, the flame-shaped mark seemed sharper than before, as if it had heard the words. They left the chamber in silence, the air above ground feeling thinner, almost brittle, after the density of what they had just witnessed. The president ordered the ledger left where it was, though the image of the cross refused to fade from his thoughts. The librarian mentioned only one other person who had been permitted into the chamber in her lifetime, a man known among staff as the archivist. No one knew his full name. His employment record was a string of half-legible entries, scattered between departments, always ending with abrupt transfers. He had a reputation for vanishing for months, only to reappear with knowledge of documents no one had catalogued. The president demanded he be found immediately. When the archivist arrived, he was older than expected, his hair a white halo around a face weathered by years of handling secrets. He carried no bag, no papers, only a small wooden box bound shut with cord. He did not offer a greeting, simply meeting the president's gaze with an expression that was neither defiant nor servile. He was led to the secure room where the manuscript now lay on the table. Without being prompted, he approached and rested both hands on its cover. His fingers trembled, not from age, but from the weight of recognition. He spoke for the first and only time, his voice low and steady. He told the president that the Kybalion had always been a fragment, a shard of a far greater whole. The missing pieces, he said, were never destroyed. They were hidden inside living memory, encoded in the minds of those whose symbols had been marked in the margins of history. The archivist then glanced toward the aides and the librarian. His eyes lingered on the president longer than the rest. He said the cipher in the librarian's glove was not merely a map, but an instruction, and the seal below was not the first nor the last. Reaching into his coat, he withdrew a slip of paper from the wooden box and placed it on the table. On it was a drawing of the same flame-shaped mark from the seal, surrounded by 8 points. But in this version, 1 point was already glowing. He looked back at the president, and with no further words, turned and left the room. No one stopped him. No one even called after him. The slip of paper lay between the president and the librarian, its faint glow seeming to pulse in rhythm with the room's silence. The glowing point in the drawing was more than a symbol. It felt like a presence. The president traced it with his eyes, and the librarian quietly suggested there might be a way to locate the corresponding artifact. Her voice carried a hesitation, as if retrieving it might awaken more than memory. From a locked drawer in the library's sublevel, she produced a cylindrical case wrapped in aged linen. The seals along its length were brittle, each stamped with a mark nearly identical to the one in the manuscript cipher. The case had been found decades earlier, buried in an unmarked crate beneath layers of catalogued documents, its origin untraceable. The president broke the first seal, and a faint static seemed to pass through the air. Breaking the second brought a whisper, not from anyone in the room, but from within the cylinder itself, as though parchment remembered the voices of its makers. The scroll inside was long, its ink faded to the color of dried leaves. It bore a series of tightly woven characters, looping into forms that were neither entirely text nor entirely image. Between these strands of writing was an empty space near the bottom, and in that space, faint yet unmistakable, was a signature. It was not a name, but a mark, a cross intersected by a single arc, drawn in one fluid motion. The style matched early Judean scrolls, where the Nazarene's followers had sometimes marked messages with symbols instead of words to evade hostile eyes. The librarian ran her gloved fingers near, but not on, the mark. She whispered that such a symbol was known as a silent signature, used when the writer's name was too dangerous to record. Its presence here implied not just influence, but authorship, from a hand tied directly to the teachings woven into the Kybalion's final page. As the president studied the scroll, he noticed the signature was positioned in such a way that, if the scroll were folded along certain lines, it would align perfectly with one of the cipher's outer points. The air in the room felt charged, as though unseen eyes had just turned toward them. The linen wrappings on the table shifted slightly, without a single hand touching them. The scroll was returned to its case, sealed once more with strips of fresh wax. That night, the president remained in the library's upper residence, a decision that left the official schedule mysteriously blank. The aides were dismissed, save for one stationed outside his door. The manuscript, the slip of paper, and the cylindrical case were all placed on the desk beside an unlit lamp. Some time past midnight, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, the faint scent of rain, though the skies had been clear all week, the way shadows deepened even without a change in light. The president moved to the window, pulling back the curtain. Above the city, the stars were unusually sharp against the blackness, as though the atmosphere had been scrubbed clean. At first, they seemed scattered in ordinary constellations, but his eyes caught an arrangement that felt intentional. Several stars formed a curve, intersected by a vertical alignment of brighter points. Together, they mirrored the flame-shaped mark at the center of the seal, down to the smallest detail. He reached for a pair of binoculars on the desk, but the closer view didn't reveal more. Instead, it deepened the impression that the pattern was deliberate. The curve of the stars even appeared to shimmer faintly, like ink catching candlelight. The librarian, summoned from the next room, stood beside him and gazed upward. She confirmed what he saw and whispered that certain hermetic traditions spoke of celestial seals, patterns in the night sky that only emerged when the time to act had arrived. They were said to appear in alignment with hidden artifacts, as if the heavens themselves marked their location. The president recalled the point on the archivist's drawing that had glowed. It sat on the curve's outer edge, exactly where one of the stars now burned brightest. Without turning from the window, the librarian said the words on the margin of the ledger had spoken of the law written before the stars. She reminded him that the Nazarene had once told his followers that signs would appear in the heavens, signs for those with eyes to see. The brightest star pulsed once, then twice. In that moment, it felt less like the sky was being observed, and more like it was observing them. The president sat at the desk, the scroll unrolled before him, its faint scent of old parchment mixing with the cool draft slipping in from the slightly open window. The librarian stood nearby, silent, as if afraid a single word might fracture whatever was forming in the air. The slip of paper with the glowing point lay beside the scroll, and the match between the star's position and the cipher's design was undeniable. He began folding the scroll along the faint creases hidden in the weave of its fibers. Each fold aligned fragments of symbols in ways that changed their meaning, revealing new shapes that had been invisible when the scroll lay flat. The first fold brought the arc of the silent signature into alignment with a spiral in the upper margin. The second fold joined that spiral to a series of small marks that now formed a path, winding toward the center. With the third fold, the glowing point from the archivist's drawing landed directly on the silent signature. The moment it touched, a shift occurred, not in the room's light, but in the light itself. Shadows drew sharper, edges glinted with an otherworldly clarity. The air hummed, not as a sound but as a pressure in the bones. The librarian's eyes widened. She whispered that in ancient texts, such a fold was called the convergence, a moment when object and design ceased to be separate. She said it was believed to unlock not just knowledge, but passage. The president looked up at her, his expression unreadable, then back at the scroll. There, in the newly formed center, the silent signature had transformed. The simple arc and cross now burned faintly with lines extending outward, forming the complete star from the cipher. The flame shape at the heart seemed almost alive, its edges flickering as though lit from within. The glow from the mark pulsed in sync with the rhythm of his heartbeat. The librarian stepped closer, but stopped just short of touching the parchment. She said the mark would only remain visible until the final fold was made, the fold that would complete the seal's opposite, the unlocking gesture. He placed his hands on the edges of the scroll, ready to finish it. The last crease was waiting. Somewhere in the silence, the faint echo of the Nazarene's words seemed to move through the air. What is hidden will be brought to light.